Hello and welcome to Speaking of Listening. I'm streaming this to my personal page because for some reason it wouldn't let me stream to the place where I usually have it. So I will have to put it here and then maybe share it to where it usually is. So if you're wondering who the heck is this guy and what is he ranting about, well, stay tuned. Because today I want to talk about boundaries and specifically why boundaries don't work. You say, what? What are you talking about? Boundaries are really important. Yes, they are. So what do I mean by that? Couple things. So I'm going to talk about how the way that they're often expressed does not have the intended effect, and the reason why and what can be done instead. And in particular, and what I want to talk about first is how many times boundaries in these so-called I messages are actually disguised you messages. In other words, a a boundary, as I'm sure you're aware, a boundary is about me. It's not about you, it's about me. So the thing is that so many times why even try to set a boundary in the first place? Well, because the other person is engaging in some kind of behavior, including words being said, that is not okay. And yes, it's important to make it clear what is and isn't okay, because as in the common phrase goes, we teach others how to treat us. So yes, the end, the goal of boundaries is certainly something which is very important. But here's the dilemma. The dilemma, and it gets back to what I've expressed before about how communication is just a very simple process, but simple is not always easy. Communication is one person sending a message and the other person receiving a message. The thing to remember is that if neither of one of those occur, then there's no communication. And a boundary is only going to be effective if there is communication about it. If there's no communication, if the communication does not occur, then the intended impact of the boundary is not going to be met, because the message was not have been received. So when a boundary is expressed as a disguised you statement, then people's antenna pick up on that. That's the problem with so many of the structures of so-called I messages, because so-called I messages often begin with the phrase, when you come home later, when you talk to me in that manner, I feel disrespected. The thing is that whenever anybody hears when you to begin with, the shields go up. It's like, oh, so that's a failure of actually communicating, because first of all, it's not really a boundary, it's more of a disguised you statement. And then the second failure is on the receiving side, because they're all of a sudden resistant to hearing anything. Because when, this is why so-called you messages are discouraged, because what's a you message? A you message is pointing the finger and blaming, and beginning any sentence with when you, well, that's about as you message as you can get. So that structure, that way of expressing a boundary, generally doesn't work very well. Now, a very common situation is that if I'm being spoken to in a manner which I don't find comfortable, then the boundary that's often said is, well, I'm not okay being spoken to to that way, or often it be, you can't speak to me that way, which again gets back to the whole you problem. But even if you leave the you out, I won't be spoken to that way. Okay, what's the problem with that? Well, that there's actually, that's a very effective way of expressing it. So expressing the boundary as something about me and not about you, yes, that is important. So why am I saying that doesn't work? Because if that person is sort of saying something, usually it's got they're pointing the finger, they're making accusations, they're blaming, shaming, whatever that is. And believe me, I am not saying that that's okay. When I say that boundaries don't work, I don't mean that you need to put up with anything which is not okay. But remember, communication also involves the other person receiving the message. So a boundary is a message. It is sending the message, and that message needs to be received for that boundary to be effective. And so if that is immediately said before the other person is open to hearing it, then it will not really be received, because when somebody is in that state, if somebody is why are they, if they're being critical or they're blaming, their emotions are such that they're not going to be open to hearing anything that contradicts what they're about. So being told, okay, you can't talk to me that way, or I won't be spoken to that way, however it's phrased, that is not going to land on somebody who is blaming, shaming, and pointing the finger. And so communication failure means that the boundary really hasn't been effectively communicated to the other person. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to first track the other person. When you hear something which is not okay, first track and validate what is behind that. Remember, validating is not agreeing. You're not agreeing with that. You're not accepting that it is okay to be spoken to that way. And the thing is that you want to communicate that at a time when that person is open to receiving it. They're not going to be open to receiving it until they have been validated. And so you validate them first. You track them all the way down to the lookup. And I've talked about tracking and the lookup in other videos. If you just as a brief reminder, tracking is all about validating what's behind it. So it's not okay with you that that so and so happened. Again, you want to, in tracking, ironically, we we use the pronoun you, but not in a blaming way. It's not a tracking statement. It's not a you statement. It's a validating statement. And the word you is used because it focuses attention on the speaker, on that other person. And we avoid I because we want all of the energy to be focused on the fact that we are attending to what this person is expressing. And it's to recognize that even when they're blaming and shaming and pointing the finger at us, that there is some kind of other angst going on. There's some kind of pain, sadness, fear, whatever it might be, is going on beneath it. That is what we're validating, not the surface of what they're expressing. That's why I'm not a fan of active listening as it's usually practiced. Why? Because it's not in the words. Active listening focuses on the words. I hear you say, not what I hear you say. It's what's behind what I hear, what the words are. And the I in there focuses attention on me, the listener. And so even if the person receives that, they think, well, okay, he heard me. Did he hear me say that? You don't want them to be dealing with that. If they're expressing something, you want them to be focused on kind of what is behind. With tracking, we help them get to what is behind that, whatever the emotions are behind the blaming and the shaming. And once that has happened, and my experience and the experience of everybody who is an effective tracker is that it is nearly impossible to stay upset and blamey when the other person is validating, when the other person is effectively tracking you. And the thing is that that is not the purpose of it. The purpose of it isn't to get the other person to calm down or look up or actually do anything. The only agenda when tracking is to validate what is behind what is being expressed. And that is especially true, especially relevant when they're pointing the finger and blaming. And so, and what happens, and if you have any experience with tracking, then you'll notice that when the person kind of finally feels heard down to their toes, there's this palpable energy release. It's like all of a sudden, just they're open, and you can detect that. You can really sense that okay, now all of a sudden they don't have to keep pushing and fighting and doing whatever it was that was driving them to be engaged in that thing, which was unacceptable, of course. That doesn't make, validating and tracking first does not mean that we are agreeing that it is okay to be talked about that way. Now, when they have been tracked down to that lookup, then and only then are they going to be open to receive your boundary? And that looks something like, I'm always open to hear feedback. I'm not okay to be called names. It's not okay to call me stupid. It's not okay to be called lazy. It's not okay to use the words that were being used. Again, I'm always open to hearing thoughts and feelings. It isn't okay to be spoken to that way. The thing is that, and that may sound a little more gentle than what you may be used to. However, because you are expressing it to somebody who's all of a sudden their heart is open because they have been heard and validated, then they are much more likely to really receive it. And now all of a sudden, instead of focusing on their own pain, all of a sudden they can see what's going on with you. And that is the critical thing when it comes to boundaries, that they are recognizing the impact of what they were doing or saying on you. And before then, it's like, have you ever had a toothache and tried to focus on anything else? It's almost impossible. If you're in some kind of physical pain, then that just colors every experience, and that's always kind of there going, oh. The same is true of emotional pain. So and the clue is, if somebody is acting, they're speaking to you in a disrespectful way, in a way which, again, pointing the finger, blaming, shaming, criticizing, they're hurting. There's some angst going on, and it's impossible, nearly impossible, in that state to be able to sort of see anybody else or recognize that anybody else is there. If they were in their aware, loving heart, then they wouldn't have been expressing that way. They would have been expressing it like an impact statement, which is what iMessages really aspire to be. But they're not. Since they're not, that means that they're in some kind, they're unconscious, as Selway used to say, but they're unconscious because of the pain that they're in. Tracking validates the pain, helps them feel understood, and thereby open to hearing something else. And see, setting a boundary is something else other than what they're about. And if it is done too soon, it will either be rejected, it won't land, or it'll just kind of lead to more of a, just more of a conflict. So when I say boundaries don't work, what I mean is the format, the way in which they are done is critical. And, and even if you don't do it my way, the tracking way, whatever, the same principle holds. That is, when you set a boundary, it is critical that the other person be open to receiving it. And in that moment is not the time to do it. The time to do it, the time to set a limit, the time to set a boundary is when the other person is open to receiving it. And in that moment, they aren't. And so what can be done? Well, what do we usually do? We might, walk away and say, I won't be spoken to that way, and I'm going to leave if that continues. Well, that leaves the other person kind of hanging and sort of still stuck with their pain, with their angst. And that's another critical mindset to realize, that every time somebody is criticizing you, that they're really in pain. What if you could see things through that lens? What if you could see them through that perspective? That it's not somebody kind of yelling at you, making you wrong, which on the surface it appears to be, but there's somebody who's kind of hurting and they're almost going, owie, owie, owie. So they have an owie, and that's why tracking is so effective, because it soothes the owie. It helps them feel heard and understood, regardless of what they're expressing, what they're saying. So I hope this offers you some insight into, maybe if your boundaries haven't been landing or haven't been working, maybe some insight into why not. And yes, boundaries are important. How they're delivered is even more important. And as I have a free ebook called No More Arguments, where I go with my friend Carrie Glenn, who assisted with this. It goes into tracking and even has a checklist for tracking at the end. It's a wonderful thing. I encourage you to download it. I'm going to leave a link in the comments so you can check it out. And until then, remember that listening is loving.